Hello and welcome to the Just and Sinner podcast. I am your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper, and thank you so much for joining me once again on the program today. And as always, we want to give you a reminder that Just and Sinner as an organization is supported by donors, so we would ask that you would consider becoming a regular contributor. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization, which means that any gifts that you do choose to give us are tax deductible. And if you want to become a partner with us, you can go to justandsinner.org and go to the donate page there. You can do it through Patreon as well, patreon.com/justandsinner. There are a bunch of different ways that you can contribute, and we are very much grateful, very thankful for the resources you are able to provide for us. And as you provide resources for us, this means that I can continue to do this and do this as a job, that I'm able to spend a lot of time preparing for podcasts and writing and producing all of the kinds of materials. We also have an editor that we have hired who is working part-time for us as well. So those are the kinds of things that you are helping to fund as you sponsor us. We are also looking into hopefully some translation work, which will take a bit of funds to fund a translator to get some classic Lutheran scholastic works into English that have not yet been translated. So that's something I'm hoping we can do, but we do need your support in order to do that. So on the last two programs, I have discussed near-death experiences, and it was something that I had known some about, but I had spent a lot of time prepping for those podcasts. There were 6 different books and a number of essays and lectures that I had watched in preparation for that. And I wanted to do something similar on a topic that was related, and that is on the demonic, specifically dealing with demonic oppression and demonic possession. So you may be asking, well, what exactly is the connection between these two things? Because I jumped right from one into the other. And the reason for that is because as I was dealing with the considerations of what is it that's causing near-death experiences, and more than just what's causing the experiences themselves, as I do argue that they are actual out-of-body real experiences, what is causing the things that are seen in those experiences, which often contradict one another, which are not necessarily at all consistent with one another. So how do we deal with that? Do we say it's all real? Do we say it's all in their heads? And my proposal was that it is something, there is a real spiritual realm that one is entering into, but that this is not death, and that there is a battle between demonic forces and angelic forces. And so what we see in the midst of things like a near-death experience is some things that are good and some things that are bad. And there is a blending and mixture of all sorts of things. So when one accesses the spiritual realm that isn't natural for us in our human current bodies, our fallen sinful natures, once we're out of that state, we are not immediately translated to, heaven or hell. I mean, we are at death, but this is not death, right? Near-death experience is exactly that, a near-death experience. So my argument is that we end up in a created realm as well, but we are not in our eternal state, because this is not actual death. You have not actually passed into death. So that's the argument, that we haven't actually entered into death when you have a near-death experience, which is why you come back. And the near-death experiencers recognize that as well. They talk about a kind of going beyond a certain point, and that they will, pass into their final state once they enter into that point. But because it's not really death, we shouldn't expect one to enter into their eternal state yet at this point. So we have glimpses of things. I think we have things that are from God and things that are demonic. There are other proposals as well. I've tried to consider those, and there are some that I haven't considered because I haven't read everything on the topic. This is a topic that I've tried to do a bit of research on, but it is a newer one to me. So, but the reason why that I wanted to delve into the demonic is to kind of explore a little bit more of what is the role of the demonic in our everyday life? What is the role of the demonic in our earthly experiences? If I'm going to be making this the point as part of my thesis that within near-death experiences, there is often a demonic element to it. And not in every near-death experience, not in every way, but there often can be what I perceive as a demonic element. So what are the role of demons? How do these things work? How do they fit together in our ordinary life? So in light of that, I decided to do a bit of a deep dive into this subject as well, because it's very much related, and it's, I think, a really important topic. It's one that I've had some personal experiences with, and it's something that I think is really important for the church to deal with. And I am not a naturalist, so I believe that demons are real. I do not believe that demons are just some kind of linguistic idea to represent the pervasive nature of evil in the world. I believe that demons are literally real. I believe that the devil is literally real. I believe that angels are literally real. Okay, that's the perspective I'm coming from. If you are, a naturalist, feel free to reject what I'm saying, but that's the perspective I'm coming from. So I want to be upfront about that before I dive into this. So I think it's more than mythology. I think it's more than something like this is a mythology that developed out of our kind of collective unconscious minds, that we recognize evil, pervasive evil in the world, and then we kind of embody that in this mythological development. Now, certainly there are mythological developments that occur because we are trying to kind of express and tell ideas that are deeply ingrained within our human psyche. But I would argue that the reason why that there is such a pervasive conception of spirits is more than just mythology to describe what is evil, but is an expression of something that is deeply ingrained in reality itself, that there is evil. There are evil spiritual forces. So, in order to prepare for this, I've been reading some books, and this is only the first part, so I want to delve into a second part as well, where it gets a little more specific in terms of how it is that different Christian traditions approach demon possession and how we deal with exorcisms. But these are the books that I have started with. One is Demonic Foes by Richard Gallagher. That was really interesting. It's a Roman Catholic who has been involved in exorcisms. He's a psychologist. So he's kind of the guy who evaluates these individuals to say, is there a psychological element to what's going on? Is there something really demonic? He's been involved with various priests who are exorcists. So he tells a bit of his story there. It's very helpful. The guy has numerous Ivy League degrees. He's someone who is very well educated and very well studied, someone who is very reputable in an academic sense and in his clinical work. He's published, somebody that is not kind of a wacko. And this is what we're going to deal with as we look into this. Is this topic becomes so annoying just because of the amount of kind of crazy stuff that gets invoked, or the wacky ideas that are said to be part of any acknowledgement of the demonic. We have individuals that kind of make a show out of exorcisms and things that are obviously fake, and we have people that are arguing that every single illness or sickness or psychological disorder is really just demons, and psychological disorders don't exist. You just have the demon of depression or the demon of anxiety or whatever. Well, we're going to talk about some of that. We're going to unload that. So that's kind of the what I would call the crazy end of things, and that's not where he's coming from here. Okay, so that is going to be a perspective that we're going to talk about a little bit in some of the extremes, and talk about what's wrong with those extremes. So Richard Gallagher's book, again, I found it really helpful. I think it's very balanced. He's clearly telling his own personal experience, so his own personal ideas certainly get into the text. It's not like an impassionate study, but a very helpful one with a lot of anecdotes from his own life and a lot of descriptions of experiences that he was not the only witness to. So one doesn't only have to take his word for what happened as he records. The second was Playing with Fire by Billy Hallowell. What I wanted to do was I want to kind of take books on this topic from different Christian perspectives and say, what's the Roman Catholic perspective? What's a evangelical perspective? And so this was my attempt at reading something that was more of an evangelical take on this, from just kind of broader evangelicalism. Playing with Fire. And the guy who wrote this book is a journalist. I was not familiar with him prior to this book, and I will tell you that this book did not leave me impressed at all. So to be honest, I thought it was very poorly done. Now, there are some interesting stories at the beginning. As a journalist or a reporter, he does a good job at writing what these people's experiences are and who saw them and documenting some of these details. But when he gets into theological explanation, it's almost as if every question he just did a quick Google search about demons or the angelic realms. It's almost like he did a quick Google search and clicked on the first link and then cited that in his book. Like he cites Got Questions and Matt Slick at Carm, and these are like internet sources that aren't good. I mean, they're not. And I understand that, people like popular resources, but these are not sources that I would consider reputable sources that I would ever cite in any theological paper of any kind. And, if I had students as a seminary professor, if I had students in my doctrine course that were like citing Carm on everything or Got Questions, I would talk to them about it and say, this is not a good source. Like you can't use these things. You can use them to some extent to say, this is a popular level explanation that some people have given, but there's such extensive citation of these resources that just aren't great. There's a lot of time spent on statistics of what people believe, which is okay. I don't know how important a lot of that information was. It felt like a little overloaded with that. But, nonetheless, I wanted to get an evangelical perspective on this. I didn't personally find the book very helpful, but it seems like it's decently popular, so that's what it is. The next one that I read is Afraid, Demon Possession and Spiritual Warfare in America by Robert Bennett. This is the best book I've read on the subject so far. He's a Lutheran, of course, because that's what I'm going to say is the best. No, really, I think he handles this issue very well. I think it's very balanced, and it's scriptural. It avoids sensationalism, but it also avoids the kind of naturalism of just kind of dismissing all of this stuff altogether. The one I'm reading right now, I'm in the middle of, is called My First Exorcism. Let's see. What the Devil Taught a Lutheran Pastor About Spiritual Warfare by Harold Ristow. This is really good so far. I'm really enjoying this one, but I'm almost halfway through it at this point, so I can't tell you enough about it. But John Kleinig wrote the foreword, and John Kleinig is wonderful on this topic and pretty much any topic. So he's very useful. So those are the resources that I've read. I just, if you want to read more on this, this is where I'm coming from. These are the things that I've looked at. I have other resources I'm going to read. If you have recommendations and you want me to read some things, I would love to do that from different approaches, even if they're a little crazy. I would be interested just to see. So if you're like, this is representative of this one approach to this from a charismatic perspective, like I would be interested in reading it just to be able to evaluate it and kind of know the broader topics that are being discussed, because charismatic theology is not at all my expertise. Like I just don't, that world is very foreign to me. So with all of that being said, I wanted to give that background, and I want to start, there are a couple of things that I really want to do in this first program. And the first is talk a little about my experience and what my interest in this is. And so, yeah, it's going to be anecdotal. That's the way these things are. If you don't want to listen to me talk about my experience, that's fine. Skip ahead to the other stuff. But I'm going to do that. And the second part of this is I want to ask, can these be explained just by naturalistic means? So you want to ask the basic apologetic question. Is there a naturalistic explanation for this? So we're going to go through that, and then I'm hoping next time to get into a lot of the theological groundwork. We're going to get into scripture. I don't know how far we're going to get this time. Maybe we'll be able to do some of that. We'll just kind of see where it goes, because I never know exactly how these are going to go until I just start talking. So, all right. Well, let me just give you a little bit of a background of my own experience here and why I do have an interest in these kinds of topics. Now, as I share some information, and I don't often share a lot about my life, I purposefully don't share a lot, but I will a little bit here. But as I do that, I'm not going to say names of people, don't really want to do that, but I'm going to give some generalities about some things that occurred in my life in terms of my encounter with the demonic. So let me just start and say I believe the demonic is very real. From my earliest years, I have had some kinds of spiritual encounters with the demonic, and those have shown up at different points in my life. Doesn't mean it's a constant thing for me, but there has been enough that I have seen that certainly has convinced me that this stuff happens. Like I've seen it, I've experienced it, and I don't have naturalistic explanations for what I've seen. So this kind of starts, I guess, my first experience with the demonic is being around an individual when I was very young, who I now believe to have been demonically possessed, and there are, I think, good reasons for believing that to be the case. And when I was very young, this individual was doing weird kind of evil chants over me as a little kid. And one of my parents saw it and stopped this from happening and took me away from them. When I was little, I used to hear, specifically when I was in my basement growing up, I used to hear the voice of that person in my head saying weird things to me. I don't actually remember the details of what was said, to be honest. But I do know that it was very scary. I know that it stopped me from sleeping at night. I remember, my parents being worried at one point that maybe I had some kind of psychological disorder, which was causing me to hear things. Eventually that did fade away. So, I don't know. It went away at some point. And I guess you could say, as a little kid, maybe I was scared by what I had heard. And so I had kind of made this thing up in my head, and I had repeated that in my head. That could be the case, except for the fact that supposedly, I'm only relying on others' testimonies, but supposedly I was not even paying attention when those things had been said over me at all. Like I was oblivious to what was even being said. So the fear did not come directly from that. There's no indication of that. So anyway, I heard those voices in my head, in my basement when I was young. I absolutely believe that was something demonic. This individual ended up passing away, and after their death, there were a lot of strange occurrences that were happening. That includes pictures flying off of the walls, and I mean pictures that were held down pretty well. You couldn't just bump it and knock it off; they had to be lifted up above the nail and fall. There were instances of plate of food being thrown in the air and falling down off a table. A little strange. There was an instance of jingle bells ringing overnight when those bells were under a bed, and there was no one touching them. There was no seeming way that anyone could have gotten a hold of them. So it seems clear to me in that experience that this was something that is not explainable by human means. There are a lot of connections there. The same individual is chanting, the same individual I heard in my head, and the same individual has a bunch of poltergeist activity happen right after death. All right, this all seems pretty connected. And so if I'm going to acknowledge the existence of the supernatural realm, certainly it is not a logical leap to put those things together. Okay. And there are other signs of things as well. This individual was known for ripping out pages of the Bible when angry, and some other odd things as well. And there's a lot more to that story, but that's just kind of the brief of it. So to say, I have encountered this when I was older, as a teenager. It seemed like everyone that I knew got involved in the occult in one way or another. These were largely kids from Christian households, but not exclusively. And by the occult, I mean they had gotten interested in largely Wicca. Wicca was a big thing back then, at least in my hometown. Talking to other people, I guess it wasn't just a thing that everybody became a witch, but at least in my hometown, it was like everyone was a witch. It just was what everyone did. So, and the area I live in now is very much like that as well. But I guess most parts of the country it's not quite as prevalent. At least it was in Massachusetts where I grew up. I don't know. And there were quite a few witchcraft stores and stuff around, and you'd walk in those stores and you'd feel a heavy, dark presence. It was weird. It was very weird. So I had a number of friends that got interested in Wicca, in witchcraft in different ways. And those friends who had gotten involved in witchcraft had all sorts of weird things happen, just as you'd expect. Now, of course, as a naturalist, you would probably just say they're kind of reading into it, because it's true that we do read meaning into things that there is no meaning in. This is, as humans, this is what we do. This is why you see a face in the clouds, or you see a shape of something in the clouds, and you assume it to be your mind takes abstractions and puts them into a pattern so that it sees things, even if there aren't really things there. So that is true, right? We do that, and it certainly could well be the case that that probably a lot of what happened there is when you get involved in creepy things, you start to see creepy things. Right? You see a horror movie and you hear noises around the house that you'd probably normally hear around your house, but now you're interpreting them in a different way because that's on your mind. So there's no doubt that there's some of that as well. That's kind of a natural thing that we all do. That's part of how we're constituted, is to find meaning and purpose and to find patterns in things. But there are a number of things that did occur that cannot be explained purely as patterns, that you're just kind of interpreting things in a certain way. So I remember being at a friend's house who was really into witchcraft. She had this whole bookshelf that was all books about witchcraft. And when I was at this person's house, there were 3-4 of us there, I believe, at the time. And there was no one else at the house. We were in this person's room and the door was closed, and we were hanging out listening to music, probably like screamo or metalcore or something like that, because this was like Scenester days. And, while we were listening to like Every Time I Die or something, whatever it was, I don't know. But all of a sudden the doorknob just started turning on the door by itself. And we're like, oh, maybe her sister must have gotten home. So we, open the door. There's nobody there. There's nobody home. So we saw a doorknob kind of go back and forth a bunch of different times. The curtain started blowing around in the room, and we're thinking, okay, there's a window open somewhere. There's air coming in. There's a fan on. No, there's nothing. None of the windows are open. There's no fan. Curtains are just blowing around, and the knob is turning, and this stuff happened a lot. This is the one time that I was present for it. My other friends who were there, who were the ones who were into this stuff, were also there at other points and reported the same kind of things. I can't tell you anything about what they saw or the validity of their claims or whether they were telling the truth. All I can tell you is the one instance when I was there, when I saw activity that didn't seem to make sense from a naturalistic perspective, and then just the fact that these were people involved in the occult kind of makes sense of all of that stuff. So I have seen and encountered demonic activity throughout my life at different points, from childhood until that time. In ministry, I have certainly seen things that are demonic as well, and I assume that almost every pastor has at some point. And it depends on what kind of level you're talking about. We're not talking about everybody seeing The Exorcist or head spinning around. And I've actually never heard of a really kind of a head spinning around like that. But not that kind of stuff, not that level of stuff, but at least to some level. I've spoken with pastors who explain experiences where they're unable to control their bodies, and they go grab a knife and hold it up to their own throat, and have to cry out to Jesus for it to stop because they can't control themselves. We should expect that there will be demonic activity toward pastors. We should expect that there would be attacks toward those who are bringing people the gospel. That's what they hate. So it is natural that would be the case. In my own ministry, again, not saying any names or giving any indications of when and where these things happened, but in ministry at one time there was a situation where a certain individual was having demonic attacks, to the extent of writhing around on the floor, screaming in a weird voice. And there was an instance where this occurred in the middle of a Bible study, and another individual in that Bible study then also had these things start happening to them later. and there were demonic attacks. Sleep paralysis is often associated with these kind of things. For whatever reason, that seems to be there as well. So I've seen that. I've encountered people that I do believe were oppressed at the very least by demonic forces, and at times those who are possessed. But it must be said, possession is not common. To say that possession happens is not to say that possession happens all the time. It's not to say that there are demons around every corner causing every evil thing in the world. But this is what you often see, and this is kind of the caricature. It's like the TBN stuff, right? It just, or Bob Larson. If you ever want to see a crazy person, like the craziest of the, demon casting out of demon stuff, look up Bob Larson on YouTube if you haven't seen him. I mean, he's in Arizona, and he has this like ministry where he just goes around and delivers demons, and it's always like this very dramatic thing of people screaming and growling in low voices, and they're hissing and flying across the floor, and he just rebukes them in the name of Jesus, and all of a sudden they're healed. Like, you get this just sensationalized stuff that kind of makes a mockery of what is a real thing. Okay. So by the way, one thing that when you get into these conversations, I always go back to the satanic panic of the 1980s and 90s. And I think that's something I actually do want to deal with a little bit, is how to tease that out and how to deal with that movement and phenomena culturally and historically, without saying that therefore that disproves any demonic activity because there was a scare and there were proven lies and there were. It's a crazy movement. I've done like an insane amount of reading on the satanic panic. I don't know what's wrong with me, but I spent like hours watching these YouTube videos from the 80s and 90s. They're like old VHS tapes of people talking about the satanic panic, and they're talking about it like from a Christian perspective, kind of talking about what's going on in the world. So I know all about the kind of the frauds, okay, and the horrors and scares that aren't real. And so I can definitely talk about that, how to discern what's real from what's fake. But the fact that you can prove that things are sensationalized and fake does not mean that it is in no way real. Okay, and this is what people often do from a naturalistic perspective, is say, well, people say crazy things all the time, and here you had these people saying that there was this secret satanic cult, and now we know, looking back at this, that the stories that started this, the Satan Cellar and all of these other, Michelle remembers there was a number of these books that kind of caused the satanic panic, and they were all proven to be false, and they were based on faulty psychology, because they were based on recovered memory therapy and hypnosis and things that just are not valid ways of doing psychology. They are not valid ways of finding truth. A lot of people believe they had these experiences, but they were really implanted experiences. They were not real. They came to think of these experiences as real, but they weren't. So we can talk about some of that as well. But I will say this. I had a conversation with, and he's pretty well known for this, George Mather, who's a pastor in the Missouri Synod, who has been involved in a lot of these cases, and in exorcisms and demonic possessions. I met him in Nevada. I think he's from Massachusetts, where I'm from. But we had a conversation about this, and he had some really kind of wild stories about his experiences there. And we talked a little bit about the satanic panic, and he said, and he worked with law enforcement as well with some of these cases actually, and he had said, yeah, there were a lot of this was very, very like obviously a lot of this was fake, a lot of this was overblown, and a lot of this there were plenty of cases of innocent people being accused of all sorts of things that they shouldn't have been accused of. But he said there really were crimes that were very clearly satanically motivated. And a lot of times those things can get overlooked because, yes, the idea of some kind of overarching satanic Illuminati that all of these daycares were part of, and all of this whole conspiracy stuff. Sure, that may have just been complete bunk, but this did start in some ways with real murders and things that had happened that used satanic symbolism. Like, these are documented things that we know actually happened. It may not be a worldwide satanic cabal, but it certainly is the case that there are people doing things who are involved in the occult, and that is what motivates them to do these things. And there are small satanic groups. There are covens and all sorts of other things. This is real stuff. All right, so let's jump from that then into the question of how do the naturalists deal with these kinds of things. Now, of course, the naturalists are going to point out, as I already said, they're going to point at the things that are obviously fraudulent. So, for example, if you're familiar with the story of Mike Warnke, who claimed that he's my friend on Facebook, but it was very strange. He added me on Facebook one day. I was like, oh, that's the Satan seller guy. So, but Mike Warnke was a very popular Christian comedian, and he had this story that he spun that got him a lot of speaking gigs. And in these speaking gigs, he talked about his role as a satanic high priest. And there were child sacrifices. There was like every horrible thing you can possibly imagine. There was eventually an expose on him, which showed that it's similar to like the Ergen Cantor thing with his background in radical Islam, supposedly, that we can find documented evidence that that's not the case. Like, we talk to people he knows, we know the records of where he lived when. We can compare that with what he's claimed. Again, just like Ergen Cantor, if you're familiar with that story at all, it's a very similar kind of thing. And that was very sensationalized as well, because after 9/11, you get a lot of, you get a lot of attention going around and saying that you are a radical Islamic terrorist and converted to Christianity. It sells a lot, it sells well, of course it does. People love these sensational stories. So if you say you're a Satanist and you're ahead of the satanic high priest and all this other stuff, and that's what Mike Warnke did. Anyway, it was proven to be false. So a lot of times when you look at a lot of the critiques of the demonic from a naturalistic perspective, the first thing they're going to do is point at the frauds, right? They're going to point at the fraudulent examples that, hey, it appears that every time that we have this scare, something seems real, we look into it, and when we look into it, it comes across as fraudulent. So therefore, we can assume that the cases that we don't know the answer for yet, they're probably fraudulent too. We just haven't found exactly how, or we haven't found the details of how this works, right? It's like if you have a bunch of murders and you find, say, 3/4 of the killers and 1/4 of the killers in this set of murders you can't find, it doesn't mean there were no murderers. It just means you haven't found them because you know how this works. You see the signs of what makes a murder victim as opposed to someone who died of suicide or natural causes or whatever. It's the same kind of thing. So you say, okay, well, we know there's a pattern. We just haven't figured out exactly how it works yet. So, and it's kind of understandable, especially when you do look at some of the, I think, crazy stuff, that someone would come to those kind of conclusions. Now, what I have seen, though, in a lot of naturalistic explanations is a lot of these people have not actually looked into the particulars a lot of the really detailed cases that we do have a lot of eyewitnesses for that have supernatural phenomena attached to them that cannot be explained in a naturalistic manner. And that's really what we want to emphasize if we're going to be talking about the question, are these things purely explainable as natural phenomena in the physical, material reality that we live in? So are they explainable in that way, or are they not explainable in that way? Now, I want to say this about methodological naturalism. When someone is coming from the perspective of methodological naturalism, they are going to conclude methodological naturalism at the end. It is a system, it is a worldview, it is a system of belief that you use to interpret things, so that if you are not open to a supernatural explanation, you're not going to find a supernatural explanation. Because when you're looking for a material explanation and you can't find a material explanation, you can always go to, well, maybe this, maybe that. You can talk about possibilities. And if you don't have that, you can just say, well, we just haven't found the natural explanation yet, but that does not mean that there isn't one. That's the way naturalism works. So if you're not open to any non-naturalistic explanation, if that's your worldview is naturalism, then, like, of course you're not going to come to other conclusions. Okay, so that's just how you're going to do it. You're going to find natural explanations. And if you can't, what you're going to do is then say, well, this is just the kind of God of the gaps thing that you people have always done. Science doesn't have answers to things, and you put supernatural explanations in the gaps. You say, well, where does the rain come from? Well, before people really knew about the water cycle, they'd say, well, the gods send rain. Well, now we found out about the water cycle, and theories of gods and the supernatural really just come in as a way to explain things that we don't yet have the natural explanation to. And therefore, when we understand the physical world, when we understand the natural world better, then we have more explanations, and so we need the supernatural less and less and less. So the role of the supernatural gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until we find natural explanations for everything, and then the supernatural is just gone as having any explanatory necessity whatsoever. That's the argument. That's what they're looking for. Now, I can give plenty of critiques of methodological naturalism, but I would say this, that there's a difference between things that are not yet explainable because of the scientific method and things that are inherently not material scientific things to be explained. And the greatest example of this is the question of consciousness. It's not just that we haven't found the part of the brain, say, that creates consciousness, as the naturalist would assume, but it's that consciousness by its nature is something inherently different from the physical. It is by its nature something that inherently cannot be explained, no matter how much we understand the brain. So no matter how much we understand what different parts of the brain do and what role consciousness has in relation to the brain in some way, consciousness is inherently a non-physical reality that cannot be explained materialistically. They would, of course, argue against that, but the more consistent naturalists are going to say, okay, consciousness doesn't really exist, because they recognize the incompatibility of these two things. So they become eliminative materialists who believe that the only thing that exists is the brain, and the consciousness is basically an illusion that our bodies or our brains create for one reason or another. They have different ways of explaining. Read Daniel Dennett or Patricia Churchland, and you'll see this. So my argument against naturalism in that way is to say they really don't understand what a classical theistic approach to reality is when they're using the God of the gaps model. Because it's not just that, say, well, things are complex and evolutionary naturalism by itself cannot explain the complexity of things, and which I would say I think there is validity to that argument, but because I do think it's the case, but those are the kind of arguments I think that they focus on. And when you're doing that, there is always a way to take those gaps and give a possible physical explanation, right? So whether it's the evolution of the eye, it's kind of the classic example that people always point to say it's really difficult. Well, naturalists, materialists, they do have an explanation. There is a way to explain how the different parts of the eye did evolve and come together. That explanation does exist. If you're looking for an explanation, you're always going to find it. It's possible to come up with those things. And so I think what we have to do, though, is go beyond that. And again, it's not that I don't find, I like guys like, Stephen Meyer and these people who I think have very valid critiques. Now, I'm not a biologist either, so what do I have to say on these areas? But take my word is useless on that. But I do like Meyer and others like that. So, and I think he has very good critiques. I think they're very valid. So. But anyway, apart from just the scientific questions of, well, can science explain exactly how things go in the natural world, we have questions of things that are not physical at all. And I think that's really where we have to go with a lot of our argumentation, is to back up a step and say, okay, well, who cares? Okay, whatever. Evolutionary naturalism, say everything happened exactly the way that current day, neo-Darwinists say that it did. Let's just grant that for the sake of argument, right? Okay, if that's true, you still can't explain consciousness because it's inherently a non-physical thing. If that's true, you can't explain the nature of causality because that is inherently a non-physical thing. If that's true, you still can't explain how a bunch of interdependent physical things simply exist with nothing outside of them holding them together. It makes no coherent philosophical, metaphysical sense. You still can't explain value judgments. You still can't explain morality as anything real, even though you act all the time as if it's real. There are all sorts of things that you cannot explain from that perspective. Okay, that's my big critique of naturalism as a whole that relates to this question of the demonic. So what I want to ask is, are there things in demonic encounters that we see that present something that does not seem to fit the natural phenomena, that does not seem to fit the way that the natural world functions? And when you look at different accounts of possession, a lot of the times the things that occur do have some kind of, or could have some kind of natural explanation, right? We have, I can make myself talk in a creepy low voice and scream obscenities at people. I can make myself roll around on the floor. And those kind of things often are, at least on a popular level, are in demonic possessions. The things that are sensationalized and make a good show, right? This is what Bob Larson loves to show because it makes him look really good if you see someone rolling around and acting like a crazy person. But we could do that. I could mimic that. You could mimic that if you want to. So those kinds of things are not proof that something supernatural is actually happening. So then the question is, okay, so those things aren't. Is it just that we take it on faith that some of these are supernatural? Or are there evidences apart from that there are some things that have occurred that are supernatural or appear supernatural that, and I think this is important as well, we have more than one witness to? That's key. Because one person can make up a story about all kinds of things. And this is what we have with, the satanic panic, is that all sorts of people came out with all sorts of stories about what they saw. And I saw this and I saw that. And then there are actually verifiable claims that you can go test in terms of what they said when they were in underground tunnels that were led by Satanists. And you go look and they're not there. Like, you can test the things that they said. So taking things on the testimony of one witness is doesn't mean that the witness is wrong, and it doesn't mean those things aren't valuable at all. But one singular witness does not give enough credibility unless they are willing to, there's something verifiable that they can mention that you can go check later. But I think that's kind of a hard thing to do with those types of experiences. So what are some of the things that have shown up in demonic possession cases where there do seem to be things that we can test and look at and say there is not a natural explanation for this? Not just that we don't know how they did this parlor trick, but that there is no explanation. There's no way that this could have been done in any other way. Now, when I say parlor trick, honestly, almost anything you see could be explained as a parlor trick. Like, there is always a way for someone to explain that something could have happened some other way. So I think what we have to deal with is high probabilities, not 100% certainties. That's just the nature of the kind of thing we're doing here. Think about it as the kind of evidences you would use in a courtroom. Right? We're talking about probabilities, who saw what the explanations are. And if you're already a naturalist, you're not going to buy into any other explanation other than the naturalistic one. But if you're not a naturalist, then you have other ways of explaining these things. So these are documented in some of the books that I mentioned here that I had read. Particularly, they are Richard Gallagher talks a lot about his own experiences and his experiences, which were not just him, but he was involved. Multiple other people were involved in these experiences. He's someone who was not like looking for these experiences or something. And that always helps as well when you have a skeptic seeing something and then changing their mind, because people that want to see things are more likely to see those things than people who don't believe it's real and then all of a sudden believe it's real because they saw it. Billy Hallowell, at the beginning of his book, Playing with Fire, when he does talk about some of the actual cases, which I said that part of the book is very good, he talks about a number of these cases as well, and he includes a number of eyewitnesses to them. So what are some of the things that we see? One is that the person demonically possesses knowledge that they would not otherwise have had. we see, for example, that someone who's demon possessed can accuse someone of sins. And oftentimes these sins are real, like the person doing the exorcism. Sins that they have committed that no one knows about. There is no possible way that person could have ever known about. I know a pastor that this happened to, who told this story about, a pastor back in Massachusetts, who told a story about when he was in a restaurant one time, and he and his wife were sitting down eating, and this man just stood up and looked at him and pointed at him and started accusing him of all sorts of sins. And he was talking about things like private thoughts that he had had that no one else knew about. But somehow this person had access to this. So in that kind of instance, this is someone that I knew and trusted that he would be telling the truth. And there were other witnesses as well. His wife was there and others were there. So it's not like he was the only witness at that time. But there are many cases of this where someone gives some kind of knowledge about the other person that there is no way that they would have naturally known. That's pretty weird, right? That doesn't give to a naturalistic explanation very easily and very well. So there's that. Then we have things. Well, we have the probably most famous that you see in movies, which is like levitation. You see levitation or poltergeist activity, and the levitation does happen. Like, it does happen. There are a number of instances that are documented where there have been numerous witnesses, and this is not something that's new, by the way. We can look back in history and look at this. And it's noteworthy that nearly every society in all of history has had a category of demon possession. And they don't necessarily call them demons, but nearly every society historically has a category of some kind of spirit indwelling somebody and causing them to do these things. And that often includes things like levitation and poltergeist activity. So it's kind of weird that this shows up in all of these different cultures. It might make you think that maybe there is a root of something real that they're actually referencing, that all cultures have actually seen this at some point in some way or another. Or, the naturalists would just say, I guess, that there's some kind of evolutionary explanation for this, that I don't know what the evolutionary benefit of a belief in the demonic would be, but, I'm sure that they have an explanation for that. So it is something that is nearly universal culturally that we see this. So there are instances going back in history a long time ago to today, and those two books that I mention a number of these, but there are instances of supernatural occurrences. Again, levitation and poltergeist, what we call poltergeist activity, things flying off shelves and flying off tables and whatever. I've seen it myself, like a couple times. I already mentioned. I don't know how else that doorknob could have turned. I don't know. There was somebody hiding in the house secretly that turned the doorknob and then ran and hid again. It just doesn't make sense. Or there was a string that was invisible that someone was pulling to cause a trick, or we all had a mass hallucination of the same thing. Like, I don't know. There are. I mean, you can come up with other explanations, I suppose. But when you see those kinds of things, it's very hard to come up with a naturalistic explanation. So that does happen. It's not like the majority of people that have dealt with demonic oppression have seen levitation. I had a friend who claimed that he did levitate because of Wicca. The guy kind of made stories up, so I think he probably was making it up. Like, I don't think he did. Okay, I think the guy said weird things and probably liked the crazy story. So it doesn't mean we believe every story. But there are enough instances of things with multiple witnesses where things like that happen. Along with that, I know that Billy Hallowell mentions this is like a really crazy story of a kid who like runs on the side of a wall, like runs up the wall, and it doesn't seem to make any sense. But what's so interesting about that story is that there were claims that there was demonic activity in this house, and investigators going there didn't believe that there was. They thought this was made up until they went and actually saw it. And there didn't seem to be any trick going on there or way for a child to run sideways up a wall. And you have numerous witnesses to an event like this. That is very difficult to explain. So you have those kinds of things that do occur. Again, not that often, but they do occur, and they occur in front of multiple witnesses who can testify to the reality of those kinds of things. Okay, you've got that. So you've got the secret knowledge of someone's sins or things that they shouldn't know about the person. There seems to be no explainable way to know it. Then second, you've got the weird activity of either levitating, things floating in the air, poltergeist activity, or running up a wall, like weird physical stuff that happens. So you do have that. And then the third thing that we see that doesn't seem to fit with a naturalistic explanation is that it's very common for the person who is possessed to start speaking a language that they don't know. They start speaking often in Latin. Now, this is something interesting is that there are exorcists who will interact with the demon only by speaking in Latin. And the person doesn't know Latin. And they will respond either in Latin or in English or whatever other language they're speaking, but they will respond to what was said in Latin. As in, they know what the person is saying in Latin, even though the person doesn't know Latin. Demons have been around for a long time. They probably know lots of languages. Latin was, especially if you're in the West, it was a language that like everyone spoke, so it makes sense that they would know Latin. And this isn't just Latin, it's the case with other languages as well. There are instances of people speaking in Spanish or French or English who don't know any of those languages or other languages as well. So with those kind of instances, again, that does not seem explainable by natural means. So generally the way that I see these explained when I looked at people trying to respond to them is they probably knew it. They probably, learned Latin somewhere. They probably heard Spanish somewhere when they were a kid, and it was somewhere in their brain, and something happened where they kind of accessed this and they didn't have it otherwise. There's, of course, no evidence that that's the case, but that's what you have to do to give an explanation, because you have to give an explanation. Or you just say, that person's lying. Which, okay, you can say that. You can say they're lying. But are all of these people lying? And when you have a number of witnesses that all experience the same thing, are all of them lying? So a couple other things that I think are important to bring up when you're talking about naturalism versus supernaturalism in this particular question. One question that's always going to be asked is, by the naturalist, and it's a reasonable question, is, well, if these things happen, why is none of it caught on video? If these things happen, why don't the demons just do it in front of me right now? Why can't we, do an experiment where we take demon-possessed people and watch them for a certain period of time and see if these things happen? And two things to say to that. One is, if you saw it on video, you wouldn't believe it anyway. Like, look on YouTube for demonic things or ghost videos, or like, there are tons of them, and a lot of them look very convincing. Now, probably the majority of them, almost all of them probably, are faked because of our current technology, what we can do with cameras, what we can do with tricks very easily now and very accessibly. So, there are whole YouTube channels that are devoted to basically just debunking ghost videos on YouTube because people make them so often. But it's to the point that there are so many fakes out there that I don't even know how you would discern what was real. How would you discern real ghost footage from fake ghost footage? And at some level, there are a lot of videos that, you can explain away, because you can find signs that this was manipulated in this way or whatever. But if they're done really well, it's really hard to even distinguish between one that would be real and one that would be a really good fake. So who knows? I don't know. I don't know how you would even have that evidence that would ever be convincing. I don't know if I would ever be convinced, because there's so much fake stuff. I don't know how to discern what's real from what's not when it comes to video. So that becomes difficult. I don't know how you do that. Second, I would say even when somebody experiences supernatural phenomena, if they are as convinced of a naturalist as they are, they're still going to find a natural explanation for it. Like A.J. Ayer has this atheist philosopher had a near-death experience where he was like out of his body and felt this horror. It was like kind of a hellish near-death experience, and he said it felt like very, very real. But he still said, "But I'm still a naturalist." Like, it's to some degree, like if these things happen, you're gonna just find an explanation for it. So if you're a naturalist and you see the doorknob going back and forth, you're gonna find an explanation. You're just going to find a way to say something else must have happened that caused this. So I don't know that there is something that could occur. I mean, maybe if somebody's head literally spun in a circle and they could go touch and view their neck and see what happened. But short of that, like, I don't know what would convince them. But another thing is, this isn't something you can like do experiments on. You can't like take demon possessed people and say, "Hey, demons, do this when I want you to when I'm viewing you." Like, that's not how. Like, this isn't how this kind of thing works. See, it's not the kind of thing you can really do an experiment with. The same thing with near-death experiences. You can't really do experimentation. It's not that kind of thing just because of the nature of the thing itself. Okay. And then the second point, though, is why... Okay, if the demons are not idiots, and seemingly they're intelligent enough, like they've been around longer than us, they know how the world works, and they know their schemes better than us, why on earth would they show themselves to a bunch of naturalists? Like, if it's true that like naturalism and scientism is one of the greatest demonic tools in all of history to convince people that there is no God, there is no judgment, there is no sin or hell, why on earth would they show up to a naturalist and be like, "Oh, hey, let me do some cool tricks and show you that I exist"? Like, it doesn't make any sense. It's the most idiotic thing they could possibly do. So why is it the case, that in, say, South America, you can visit a village and, I talk to students from Nigeria at Cornell University here, and they tell me stories of witch doctors. And like, everybody knows the things that the witch doctors do. Everybody knows that if they put a curse on somebody, that person may die. Like, this is just what everybody knows. That's their daily experience. This isn't foreign to them. They've all seen this stuff, which is largely why like charismatic Christianity does so well in a lot of African countries, is because they know the supernatural exists, and because us, enlightened Westerners think that those things don't really happen. And so like we leave it to the charismatics to do all of that, and we just ignore it, which is really stupid, but it's the case. So like, but then people ask, well, why is it always in these kinds of countries and not in America? Well, why do you think? Because in Western Europe and America, the greatest tool that the devil has used is to help us to continue to deny the supernatural itself. In a country that's overtaken, say, by voodoo or shamanism or whatever, that's where the demonic is going to show its power. People aren't naturalists. Like, the devil has these different modes of operating. And so the demonic realm is going to be more operative in an area that they are supernaturalists. So what are they going to do? They're going to frighten people. They're going to try to scare them into remaining in these systems of voodoo or whatever else it might be. And I mentioned voodoo because that's probably the most common that I've often heard narratives of. And I hear crazy stories, firsthand experiences of people who have interacted with witch doctors, where, missionaries that, I heard a missionary talk about how, the witch doctor in their town, again, this was witnessed by their whole family who was all there. They all lived there. They watched the witch doctor, and this witch doctor would put a curse on somebody, and within the week that person was dead. And it happened over and over again. Eventually this witch doctor ended up being converted, and they had the whole story about how there was like some braid in the hair of the witch doctor, which was part of this oath that they took to the demons, and eventually the person physically couldn't say Jesus, was incapable of saying it, and they cut this thing off, which was like the breaking of that oath, and this person was converted. It was a crazy, wild story, but this isn't one story. Like, these things happen constantly. There are hundreds of people, thousands of people who can tell you these stories over and over again, and they just don't fit with naturalistic explanations. But in the US and in Western Europe, it does seem that naturalism is Satan's go-to tool. So why on earth would he show himself in a way that demonstrates that that's false? It makes no sense. So of course he's not going to. Which, may sound frustrating or just an excuse. I don't know, but it's the way it is. So anyway, this was the end of my first part here. Again, this first part was really just wanting to talk about like what my experiences was with the demonic and why I don't believe these things can be explained via naturalism. So now in the next program, we are going to be delving into how it is that Christians respond. What are some different Christian responses to this? How do we deal with the demonic? What's the difference between oppression and possession? Can possession even still happen today? Or is that something that just happened in the New Testament era, that after the resurrection of the dead, of Jesus' resurrection from the dead, now that kind of demonic activity doesn't happen anymore? Because there are some theologians that come to those conclusions. So we'll talk about all of that in the next one. So hope you like this. If you are interested in future content like this, if you have other ideas about what you want me to talk about, please let me know. And make sure to subscribe on your podcast app and on YouTube, and we'll see you in the next one. God bless.